So recently, I've done a number of videos on the Jehovah's Witness religion. My focus has mainly centered on speaking to those who still identify as witnesses and do not perhaps have the luxury of leaving. There can be various reasons for this. Not least, you may have some means of employment, a marriage, or even an entire social structure which depends upon your continued affiliation. And my aim with this channel has been not so much to disprove the teachings or doctrines. There are lots of great YouTube creators out there already beating that drum. No, my goal has been a little more pragmatic. I'm not even interested in convincing anyone that they need to leave necessarily. I'm far more vested in discovering a path forward that is meaningful and positive. And I've shown how this can be accomplished from within and without the religion, which is also another important reason for those of you sympathizers out there, maybe wondering if I'm an apostate. I think you and I can agree that my motivations are not of an aggressive, destructive, or oppositional nature. I appreciate that religious affiliation is a very complicated thing. It's not always just about what's right and wrong, true or false, although that's certainly part of it. So in line with that, I'd like to talk today on the initial reasons why we identified with this group. Some of us were born into it. Others came by it through other means. But the question that is so often asked by those who've left is, how could this have happened to me? Was I crazy? How do I know I'm capable of thinking critically? In other words, how can I trust my grasp on reality and truth when the beliefs I once held with such certainty, such confidence, are now becoming more and more difficult to put faith in? How can I be sure that I'm not like the person Paul described as being carried hither and thither by every wind of teaching? After much questioning, study, and deliberation, I think the answers lie in a philosophy of mind called the law of attraction. I think our beliefs are not always purely grounded in truth, but are framed by what we value. I think that truth is discovered through the angle or the perspective we are looking at things. Or, as Heisenberg put it, what we observe is not nature herself, but nature subject to our method of questioning. In this video, I'm going to list a number of sentiments or philosophies we found compelling in this religion, and how those need not be dispensed with simply because we no longer see things as doggedly as we once did. Or maybe you've left for perfectly legitimate reasons, such as I have, but still feel disoriented as to how you can find meaning and purpose in life. And I'd like to help you through some of that. Stick around. Hey good people, I'm Derek London. Thanks for checking out my channel. Around here we talk about everything law of attraction. We discuss a lot about the psychological, scientific, and rational basis for subscribing to this philosophy of mind. And in fact, if your reality could stand some change for the better, you have only to start there, with your mind. Hit that subscribe button and settle in, because your life will never be the same. Hey good people, thanks as always for stopping by. So this topic is really a bottomless one, but today I'm going to focus on just 5 reasons the majority of us initially sympathized with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Going forward, do try to look at this independent from whether or not the teachings are true. That's another matter altogether. You see, something you will notice overwhelmingly among the ex-witness community is a lot of anger. Much of it is well justified. I'm an ex-witness myself, so obviously I'm not saying there isn't a place for that. And this anger is often expressed in calling adherents crazy, unintellectual, deluded, wishful, and ignorant. But there's a very personal and unsettling admission in such pronouncements. How so? Well, these folks once were former members. So what does that say about their state of reasoning? If the bulk of Jehovah's Witnesses are compromised intellectually, how can this reality not in turn indict your own mental integrity? It's a valid question. In fact, the angrier and more entrenched you get, the more you condemn yourself and your own faculty of reason. It's not a healthy path forward, is it? Now, this doesn't mean the witnesses are right. It's merely a question that's worth asking. Okay, so the 5 categories I want to focus on today are as follows. 1. Metaphysics. 2. Morality. 3. Existentialism. 4. Community. And finally, manifestation or free will. These are some important dispositions worth carrying over and retaining. Some of them sound like big, complicated topics, I realize that, but I'll be sure to simplify it and make it digestible. Let's talk about metaphysics. What is metaphysics? Well, it's a question about what the fundamental nature or character of reality is. Many people feel that metaphysics is purely speculative and has no place in rational scientific discourse. I disagree with this. The fact is, there are really only 2 variations that all the great metaphysical theories fall into. It's either materialism, which basically means that reality is entirely physical. It's made up of stuff, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, etc., building blocks. The other theory is that it is made up of mental stuff, immaterial stuff. For lack of a better way of putting it, supernatural stuff. That's obviously an oversimplification. This philosophy, by contrast, is called idealism. So metaphysics is broken up into materialism versus idealism. There are really only 2 options on offer. Neither can be proved to 100%, so by adopting one outlook over another, you are participating in metaphysics. You can't compartmentalize it. You can't avoid resorting to it. Well, why is that such an important question? It's a vital question because it frames how you look at reality. If everything is just dead, blind, and stupid stuff bumping into each other, then conscious human beings and everything else is kind of pointless. You don't really have free will. You're a meat robot, a wet computer that is nothing more than the sum of all of its components. This issue gets very complicated, and I've said a lot about it. But if we really are conscious, if the universe really is ordered and there's a point to it all, you will conduct yourself in accordance with that worldview. This is really where the idea of God comes from. I prefer to call this whole phenomenology mind to escape so much of that religious baggage attached to the word God. I'll link some videos below in the description if you'd like to learn more about it. But the important thing to know here is that no one has really solved this problem of metaphysics. The sciences remain completely divided on it. But they are both fictions in the way that the presumption of innocence is. That presumption has almost nothing to do with it being true or false, but it frames how justice is carried out, doesn't it? Likewise, your metaphysical leanings will influence how you live your life. Now, it's true, there are certain doctrines the witnesses teach that are materialistic. For example, they believe that human beings do not have souls surviving bodily death. When you're dead, that's it, you're worm food. But in every other way, they are idealists. They do believe that ultimate reality, God, is not physical. And they may or may not be right about that. But I think it comes from a rational place to believe that consciousness or mind or something that is personal, immaterial, eternal, does not degenerate or behave the way physical properties do. I believe that outlook is a defensible one. And you can retain this belief in some form or another without accepting all the religious baggage that is so often attached to it. I've said before that I think this metaphysical concept of mind is the great well from which all forms of religiosity and spirituality spring. I could say much more on this, but I still have a lot of ground to cover here. Follow the links in the description if you want to discover more about this topic. So let's move on to the next category, morality. What's interesting is this list kind of builds on itself. So coming away from metaphysics, if nature is ordered, mental, or conscious, if it's eternal, if it's rational, then how we treat ourselves and others will have a grounding in something that is discoverable and objective. Worded differently, the way we behave toward one another won't be hinged on a cold, cost-benefit, survivalistic, or reciprocal principle. It means that treating ones with love is something real. It's not merely explainable by the fact that my endocrine system happened to produce an excess of serotonin and oxytocin, and so I was sweeter and more generous that day. No, it means that when you showed love for someone or behaved in a noble way, that it came from the goodness of your heart. It wasn't just that you felt all warm and fuzzy, which resulted in forgiveness or whatever other human behavior you exhibited. I've found this dynamic really becomes evident in attitudes held towards marital vows, sexuality, and traditional family values. Perhaps you've noticed this among witnesses too. Morality is a complicated subject, so I want to make a few things clear here first. I'm not saying that there is some absolute code out there. It is true that mental states do impact our behaviors to a large extent. I'm not saying that witnesses are morally superior, nor am I claiming that atheists or non-witnesses can't be ethical. I'm not addressing the rightness or wrongness in what the witnesses preach. My point is much subtler than that. I'm talking about where we establish moral and ethical grounding. You see, on atheism, I've found that while they can be every bit as ethical as any God-fearing person, I do sense a lot of cognitive dissonance when they attempt to explain right and wrong in terms of evolution or sociology or culture. There's simply little to no room for free will on that model. It means, for instance, that all there was above Hitler and his death machine was only sky. So while I no longer accept very much that the witnesses teach, especially when it comes to morality, I do appreciate where their intuitions come from. I believe there is something we can take from their perspective that is useful and grounded in rationality, despite the fact that it goes to other extremes. I hope that makes sense. Let's consider too that independent of whether God exists, and I really want to stress that point here, there are certain benefits to grounding our actions upon something more permanent and universal than the old evolutionary nature and nurture explanation. I like how one legal scholar put it. His name was Arthur Allen Leff. He once wrote a fascinating article which attempted to find an objective moral grounding for legal theory. Here's what he said, and I quote, "It's of the utmost importance to see why a God-grounded system has no analogues. Either God exists or he doesn't. But if he does not, nothing and no one else can take his place. Anything that took his place would also be him. Put another way, God, for philosophical purposes, is uniquely in the universe that being whose every pronouncement, including evaluative ones, is a performative utterance." How Arthur Leff goes on to define performative utterance throughout his essay is that there is something objective and unalterable about a moral system grounded on a belief in God, because his pronouncing something as good or bad makes it so in itself. This is contrasted by a descriptive utterance, such as the kind man-made laws tend to be. We attempt to establish right and wrong in terms of X causes Y. Therefore, X is good or bad based upon its effect on Y. Bear in mind, I'm not saying God exists, nor is Arthur Leff. The problem with morals being of the descriptive character is that it obeys the accounting of resulting consequences, whereas the performative injunctions are right and wrong in themselves, because of a belief or intuition that God said so, or that there is a right and wrong which exists out there and is discoverable. One psychologist has studied this extensively. Now, this kind of gets graphic, so bear with me, okay? What is wrong, for instance, with having sex with a dead store-bought chicken prior to cleaning and cooking it? I know, disgusting example, right? But that's the point. Why should we have such a strong reaction to that? It satisfies our sexual desire. It's sanitary, provided you clean it afterwards. There's no victim, the chicken's already dead, and it assuages your hunger. What's so wrong with it? Or take another example. A fleshly brother and sister decide to have intercourse with one another. Of course, both of them use protection, but they believe it'll be a special experience to share, and they decide not to tell anyone. Why do we recoil in disgust by such actions? There's no victim created in their behavior that we know of. It was consensual. They only do it once. They both use protection, so she won't get pregnant with potentially disabled offspring. And they keep it private. What's wrong with it? These are just thought experiments. Clearly, there is something wrong with those behaviors. I'm not actually defending it. But you see, this demonstrates that we all have a moral intuition to some extent, which is almost religious in its nature. That is, it's not grounded on X causes Y rationality. These actions are not deemed wrong by their consequences. They are regarded as wrongful in themselves. In philosophy, this field of study is called deontology. And that's how Arthur Leff more or less finishes his essay. He continues, "All I can say is this. It looks as if we are all we have. Given what we know about ourselves and each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears that if all men are brothers, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. Neither reason, nor love, nor even terror seems to have worked to make us good. And worse than that, there's no reason why anything should. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things now stand, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad, starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Amen, and Pol Pot, and General Custer too, have earned their salvation. Those who acquiesced deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. Altogether now, says who? God help us." Morality is an important subject, and by no means do the Jehovah's Witnesses own the franchise on it. In fact, very often they do things that are completely immoral. But my point is that what it's nested in and established upon is something rational and worth preserving, even if you no longer accept or identify with their doctrines. Something I've noticed that happens to ones who've left the Witnesses, by no means everyone, mind you, but often enough, they quite frequently frame their ethical behaviors based on what is either legal or if a victim is created in the action. I find this to be immensely disappointing when that happens. On the one hand, it's an improvement that you're not sitting around judging everyone, like what routinely happens among the Witnesses. But then on the other hand, people lose the sophistication to their ethics. It's as if they believe that these are the only dimensions to living morally. That's not healthy. Sure, we don't want to become constipated Puritans and prudes, but I do think that what underlies the witness ethic is praiseworthy and valuable. Now, in line with that, in line with how we should behave, this brings up the third disposition of existentialism. The Jehovah's Witnesses are often scorned for being wishful and deluded. And it's true, there is this naivete and willingness to believe very unlikely promises based on an incredibly dubious and narrow interpretation of Scripture. Richard Dawkins is famed for once saying that the consolation content of a belief does not augment its truth value. And that's a fair objection to religiosity of this sort. But again, this is contrasted by a nihilism and desperation that permeates the atheistic community. I agree that truth is all important. We don't want to hold views that are unrealistic or contrary to the facts. But very frequently, this too is traded for a defeat and pessimism that masquerades as realism. In other words, people often leave and console themselves that they're not suckers, subsequently adopting views which are just as contrary to reality and the facts. I'm not saying this is always a symptom of atheism, despite how common it is in that community. I think you can be an atheist who is very happy and optimistic. But my point is, there is nothing wrong or delusional about having a hope. There's nothing unhealthy in seeing things positively. The evidence, in fact, overwhelmingly shows that choosing to see the silver lining in your circumstances and adopting a positive interpretation of the facts has a profound impact on the way you go through life and the kind of opportunities you draw to yourself. This, too, is a landmark teaching in the law of attraction. This is most often observed when we confront our own mortality and the mortality of our loved ones. Let's be absolutely clear on this one point. There is no more reason to believe that life or consciousness ends following bodily death, as there is reason to believe that it doesn't. We're all in exactly the same place when it comes to what can be known of the other side. And there are many people who are equally fearful of a life that ends as opposed to a life that's immortal. Both beliefs of what happened to us can be an expression of bias or wish fulfillment. So we can't attack these views on that basis. We must look at the evidence. And based on my examination, I find there is tremendously compelling evidence on either philosophy of what happens. So until we have a better understanding, why worry yourself? If nothing survives bodily death, guess what? There will be no one to be bothered by that fact when it happens. If life does continue in some other fashion, then you will be confronted with the exact same predicament that you're in right now. So choose to see things in a way that maximizes the existence you actually do know. This one. That's what's called existentialism. The great existentialists like Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre were fundamentally right about this. There is more to belief than what is simply true or false, right and wrong. Man needs a purpose or meaning in life. He needs to know that the game is worth the candle. I think the Jehovah's Witnesses are an excellent illustration of how a deception which elevates us can be dearer than a host of low truths. And there's an ugly side to that, which easily degenerates into shameless wish thinking. Alternatively, you may have heard the expression which goes, "A truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent." In other words, a pessimistic worldview may save you a little disappointment. But guess what? It may just rob your life of purpose and meaning along with it. So I believe this existential dimension is another component to the doctrines of the witnesses which should be given its due. It's certainly no reason to stay, and it by no means proves that what they say is true. It merely shows that there was some rational basis for what we used to believe, even if such justifications were sitting under the surface and we hadn't given it much thought. The next thing I'd like to speak on just briefly is community. The fraternity among the witnesses is hardly an identifying mark of true worship, as they would have it. I would say it's simply a redeeming quality about human nature in general. But many academics have studied how religion often fosters strong ties of community. There have even been many prominent atheists who have remarked that their message really struggles with a fragmentary element within it. Yeah, community exists among atheists, but it doesn't typically unite. It doesn't promote harmony. And it's also been observed, overwhelmingly I might add, that it doesn't foster much charity either. Paul Kennedy has really detailed this fact in his book, Parliament of Man. As a longtime former member of the Jehovah's Witnesses, I can personally attest to how well the Brotherhood pulls together when tragedy strikes. Now, it's often spoiled by how they treat those on the margins or ones who've been excommunicated. But I don't think we can deny that there are some very inspiring stories of how the Jehovah's Witnesses have pulled together and formed a loving community. So this too is something worth striving for if you're no longer a member. The Witnesses hardly hold the franchise on it. It exists in many church and social groups. Speaking again from personal experience, I've seen this exact same dynamic among the Baptists, the Anglicans, the Methodists, the Catholics, and many, many other faiths. Despite me lacking a belief in a personal God, certainly the biblical God, I can tell you that these communities can be a wonderful refuge from the cold. Try to look past the differences in our worldview and focus on the sense of community which attends such faiths. It can also be found among volunteer groups, such as at the soup kitchen, or at the barroom billiard table, both of which, especially the latter, I have been no stranger to either. Now I'd like to speak on another assumption the witnesses hold, which are worth retaining, and that is a fundamental belief in free will. This too is a complicated topic I've commented on in great detail, and it stems from certain metaphysical fictions also. I've found that believing you live in an ordered universe, where your actions have more significance than just their immediate effects, and where thought and agency are primary, reality is not so bleak. Whereas the other fiction, that you're nothing but the final result of mindless, unguided processes, which ends abruptly at death with no permanence and meaning, this so very often robs us of our vital creative energy now. It so frequently causes ones to adopt a defeated and victimized attitude. Now, there are elements within the organization which robbed us of our free will, such as how our thoughts and actions were censored, or how we pursued careers and life paths that furthered the interests of the governing body over all others. But there's still a very strong doctrine of free will among the witnesses, which is worth retaining and grounded in something quite rational. So those are 5 things that we can take with us, whether we leave or stay in the organization. There are many Jehovah's Witnesses out there who are loving, intelligent, and reasonable people. It's important to remind ourselves of that, lest we judge adherents too harshly, and in so doing, indict our own faculty of reason. After all, we were once believers ourselves. Surely it wasn't all complete rubbish. Please be assured that I make no apology or defense for the leadership of this group, nor their many, many corruptions. I still remain deeply critical toward them. But I feel this may be useful information to those who've been disoriented by waking up to some of the realities within this religion. It may help you separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Tell me what you think of all that below in the comments. Tell me if you believe there were some things worth retaining from your experience with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and if such things could be used to improve your situation in life now. I'd be very interested in hearing your feedback on that. This is Derek London, and we'll see you again very soon. Take care. Hey folks, did you enjoy this video? Hit them bloody like and subscribe buttons already. I come out with new content every week. And if the topic I just spoke on interests you, continue down this rabbit hole by clicking one of those cards on this screen. You stayed till the end of this one, I am sure you will love the next one. Many thanks for watching, until next time.